The blackened face emerged from the darkness, knife glinting in the pale moonlight. Sergeant Thomas O'Neill moved with impossible silence across the frozen mud of the Anzio beachhead, his breath invisible in the cold February air of 1944. Behind him, 5 more shadows crept forward, each man's face darkened with boot polish, their movements rehearsed to perfection. They had crossed the Mussolini Canal in rubber boats 20 minutes earlier, slipping through gaps in the German barbed wire like ghosts. The sound of distant artillery punctuated the night, dull thuds followed by flashes on the horizon. The Anzio beachhead had become a cauldron of death, with Allied forces pinned down and German artillery raining destruction day and night. But in the darkness between the lines, a different kind of war was being waged. O'Neill's fingers brushed the handle of his V-42 fighting knife, custom designed for the men of his unit. The 7-inch double-edged blade was perfectly balanced for throwing or close-quarters combat. The cross guard protected the hand during a thrust, and the skull-crusher pommel could shatter bone with a single well-placed strike. It was a tool designed with a single purpose: silent killing. The rain had finally stopped after 3 days of downpour, but the ground remained a treacherous mix of mud and standing water. Each step required careful placement to avoid both noise and the suction that could trap a boot. O'Neill had learned these skills not in military training, but in the forests of British Columbia, where he had stalked elk and deer long before he hunted men. O'Neill froze as the sound of a German patrol approached. 3 soldiers, their cigarettes creating tiny beacons in the Italian night. He made a silent hand signal, and his men melted into the terrain. The Germans passed within 3 feet of their position, never knowing death watched them from arm's length away. One German soldier spoke quietly to his comrades, his breath visible in the cold air. Ich hasse diese Nachtpatrouillen. Die schwarzen Teufel könnten überall sein. I hate these night patrols. The black devils could be anywhere. Little did he know how right he was. Take them, O'Neill whispered, so softly it might have been the wind. In one fluid motion, his men rose from the earth. Steel blades flashed, and the specialized V-42 fighting knives found their marks with surgical precision. O'Neill's blade slid between the ribs of the German soldier who had just spoken, piercing his heart. The man's eyes widened in shock as death claimed him. No time to scream, no chance to fight back. Beside him, Private James Miller, a former butcher from Chicago, used a garrote wire to silence another German, while Corporal William Schmidt drove his knife into the base of the 3rd soldier's skull. Not a shot fired, not a sound made. 3 German soldiers of the elite Hermann Göring Division were dispatched to eternity without ever knowing what hit them. The whole encounter had lasted less than 10 seconds, a lethal choreography perfected through months of training and combat experience. These men had learned to kill with the efficiency of machines while maintaining the adaptability that only human intelligence could provide. O'Neill knelt beside one of the bodies and attached a small sticker to the dead man's helmet. It bore their unit patch, a red spearhead with the words USA and Canada, and beneath it, in perfect German script, Das dicke Ende kommt noch. The worst is yet to come. These calling cards had become a psychological weapon, as feared as the men who delivered them. German soldiers found them on their dead comrades, pinned to empty guard posts and attached to sabotaged equipment. The message was always the same. More death was coming, and there was nowhere to hide from the Black Devils. It was February 8, 1944, on the Anzio beachhead in Italy, and no one in the German army knew that a small unit of fewer than 1,200 men was about to instill such terror in their ranks that they would soon be known by a name that would live in military legend: the Black Devils. They were officially called the 1st Special Service Force, a unique joint American-Canadian commando unit that would rewrite the rules of warfare through stealth, audacity, and lethal efficiency. And their story began long before they arrived on the blood-soaked shores of Anzio, in a desperate time when the Allies needed something more than conventional warfare to turn the tide against Nazi Germany. James McPherson had never planned to become a soldier, much less one of the most feared commandos of the Second World War. Born in the small logging town of Port Alberni on Vancouver Island, British Columbia, he had grown up with an axe in his hands, working alongside his father in the towering forests of the Canadian wilderness. When war broke out in Europe in 1939, McPherson was 23 years old, already a foreman at the lumber mill, with calloused hands and shoulders like granite from years of hard physical labor. "I remember the day Canada declared war," McPherson would later recall in a letter to his mother. "It wasn't a surprise to anyone. We'd been reading about Hitler and his bunch for years. The surprise was how fast I decided to enlist. I was signing papers the next morning." McPherson's background made him an ideal candidate for the Canadian Army's infantry regiments. His outdoor skills, physical strength, and natural leadership qualities quickly caught the attention of his superiors. By 1942, he had been promoted to sergeant and had already seen action in training exercises across Canada. But the real fighting remained across the Atlantic, and McPherson was eager to join it. "We all wanted to get at the Germans," he wrote. "Every day we weren't shipping out felt like a day wasted. Then the strangest orders came down I'd ever heard." 3,000 miles south in Biloxi, Mississippi, Robert Daniels was following a very different path to the same destination. The son of a Baptist preacher, Daniels had been a troublemaker from the start, bright but undisciplined, with a natural talent for getting into and out of trouble with equal skill. He'd enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1941, more to escape his small-town future than out of patriotic fervor. "The Army thought they could straighten me out," Daniels would tell a newspaper reporter after the war. "Instead, they just gave me better tools for raising hell." Daniels' quick thinking and physical courage had earned him a reputation in basic training. He wasn't the best shot or the strongest soldier, but he had something his instructors recognized as valuable: adaptability and a complete disregard for conventional thinking. When presented with an obstacle course, Daniels wouldn't just complete it. He'd find 3 different ways through it, usually breaking several rules in the process. By mid-1942, both McPherson and Daniels found themselves receiving unusual orders to report to Fort William Henry Harrison near Helena, Montana. Neither man had any idea what awaited them there, nor that they were about to become part of one of the most elite fighting forces ever assembled. The creation of the 1st Special Service Force came from one of the most unlikely sources in military history: the mind of Geoffrey Pike, an eccentric British scientist and inventor working for Lord Louis Mountbatten's Combined Operations Headquarters. In early 1942, with the war going poorly for the Allies, Pike conceived of a daring plan to strike at Germany's industrial capacity in occupied Norway. The concept was audacious: create a specialized force trained in winter warfare, equipped with newly designed snow vehicles that could launch raids against Norwegian hydroelectric plants powering German industries. The force would need to operate independently behind enemy lines, navigate harsh winter terrain, and strike with overwhelming force against heavily defended targets. When Pike's proposal reached American planners, it was initially met with skepticism. But the desperate situation of 1942 demanded bold thinking. The Allied forces were reeling from setbacks across Europe and the Pacific. New approaches were needed. And so, Project Plow was born. To lead this experimental unit, the Americans selected an unlikely commander, Lieutenant Colonel Robert T. Frederick, a 35-year-old staff officer with no combat experience. Frederick had actually recommended against the formation of the unit, considering it impractical. His reward for his honest assessment was to be placed in charge of turning the far-fetched concept into reality. "I thought it was crazy," Frederick would later admit, "but orders are orders, even when they're sending you off to build a unit no one has ever tried before." Frederick proved to be a leader of exceptional capability. He threw himself into designing the new unit from scratch, developing specialized training regiments, equipment, and tactical approaches. Most crucially, he fought for and won approval to create a joint U.S.-Canadian force. drawing on the wilderness skills and cold weather experience of Canadian troops. In July 1942, the unit was officially activated as the 1st Special Service Force. Recruitment began immediately with very specific criteria. The ideal candidates were men with experience in lumbering, forest ranging, hunting, trapping, or mountain climbing. They needed to be physically tough, mentally adaptable, and capable of operating in extreme environments. For men like McPherson and Daniels, the summons to Montana was just the beginning of an arduous selection process. The training program Frederick designed would be among the most physically and mentally demanding of the war. The first day at Fort Harrison, they ran us until men started dropping, McPherson recalled. I thought I was fit from all those years in the woods, but this was different. This wasn't just work. This was pushing human limits, and that was just the morning. In the afternoon, they taught us to kill. The training regimen was revolutionary for its time. Men were pushed to 18-hour days filled with physical conditioning, weapons training, demolitions, hand-to-hand combat, rock climbing, and parachute jumping. The goal was to create a force equally capable of scaling mountain cliffs, surviving Arctic conditions, demolishing hardened targets, and engaging in close-quarters combat. Frederick personally oversaw the development of a distinctive fighting knife for his men, the V-42 Stiletto. With its 7-inch double-edged blade, skull-crusher pommel, and distinctive thumb groove, it was designed specifically for silent killing. Every man in the force was trained extensively in its use. Crucially, the Americans and Canadians trained side by side, breaking down national barriers to forge a unified fighting force. Initially, there was friction. Bar fights between the nationalities were common in the early days, but Frederick insisted on integration at every level, with Canadian and American officers and NCOs sharing leadership responsibilities throughout the organization. After a while, you stopped seeing Canadians and Americans, Daniels explained. You just saw forcemen. That was it. Didn't matter where you were from. What mattered was if you could keep up. By November 1942, after 4 months of intensive training, Frederick had transformed a collection of lumberjacks, hunters, and misfits into one of the most formidable fighting forces the Allies had ever produced. The 1st Special Service Force was ready for deployment, but the war had other plans. The strategic situation had changed. The Norwegian operation, which had driven the force's creation, was shelved. Frederick's unit, trained for a mission that would never happen, risked being disbanded before ever seeing combat. For months, the force remained in limbo, continuing to train while Frederick fought to find them a role. His men had become so skilled, so lethal, that it seemed a waste of extraordinary talent to simply send them back to conventional units. Finally, in 1943, they received orders, the Aleutian Islands. The first combat deployment of the 1st Special Service Force would take them not to the mountains of Norway, but to the fog-shrouded islands off Alaska, where Japanese forces had established a foothold on American territory. Kiska Island was their target, a forbidding volcanic island perpetually wrapped in fog and battered by harsh weather. On August 15, 1943, the force led the assault on Kiska, prepared for fierce resistance from entrenched Japanese defenders. What they found instead was an island mysteriously abandoned. The Japanese had withdrawn without a fight, slipping away under cover of the persistent fog. The force's first combat mission ended without a shot fired in anger. It was a disappointment for the men who had trained so intensively for combat, but the operation proved valuable in other ways. The force demonstrated their amphibious landing capabilities in difficult conditions, and their cohesion as a unit was strengthened through the shared experience. Still, Frederick knew his men needed a true test of their abilities. They needed combat. In October 1943, the 1st Special Service Force received orders that would finally put them on the path to legend. They would deploy to Italy, where Allied forces were locked in a brutal struggle against German defensive positions in the mountainous terrain south of Rome. The Italian campaign had bogged down in the face of determined German resistance along the winter line. a series of interlocking defensive positions that took full advantage of Italy's mountainous spine. Conventional forces had repeatedly failed to dislodge the Germans from their mountaintop strongholds. The situation called for unconventional solutions. When the force arrived at the Allied headquarters in Naples on November 17, 1943, they found a war far different from what they had trained for. Rather than snow and ice, they faced mud, rain, and rocky terrain. Instead of raiding hydroelectric plants, they would be tasked with frontline combat against elite German mountain troops. But the core skills they had developed, mountain warfare, night operations, and close-quarters combat, would prove perfectly suited to the challenges ahead. Their first major objective was Monte la Difensa, a 3,000-foot mountain topped with German bunkers and artillery positions. Previous Allied attacks had been repulsed with heavy casualties. The mountain featured sheer cliffs on its northern face, considered unclimbable, and thus left relatively undefended by the Germans. Frederick saw opportunity where others saw only obstacles. If his men could scale those unclimbable cliffs at night, they could strike the German positions from an unexpected direction. On the night of December 2, 1943, with cold rain pouring down and temperatures hovering just above freezing, 600 men of the force began their ascent of the forbidding northern cliffs of Monte la Difensa. The mountain loomed 3,000 feet above the valley floor, its upper reaches shrouded in clouds and mist. The jagged face they would climb was nearly vertical in places, with crumbling handholds and treacherous, rain-slicked surfaces. Each man carried over 60 pounds of equipment: ammunition, weapons, explosives, rations, medical supplies. The weight pulled at shoulders and tested finger strength with every upward movement. They climbed in near total darkness, with only the faintest ambient light to guide them. No flashlights could be risked. A single beam might alert German sentries to their presence. "We climbed like a human chain," Private Henry Rodriguez, a former rock climber from Colorado, later described. Each man responsible, not just for himself, but for the men above and below him. You'd find a handhold, test it, then whisper back exactly where it was for the next guy. Sometimes you'd reach up and find nothing but air, and you'd have to feel around, your fingers going numb from cold and strain, until you found something to grip. The techniques they used had been drilled into them during those grueling months in Montana. How to distribute weight, how to secure footholds, how to move silently even while navigating vertical terrain. But the stakes in training had never been this high. Here, a mistake meant not just failure, but death, either from the fall or from German bullets, once their presence was detected. Halfway up the cliff face, Corporal Michael Jenkins lost his grip on the rain-slicked rock. He began to fall backward, a strangled gasp escaping his lips as he felt himself going over. In an instant, Staff Sergeant David Cohen, climbing just below, braced himself against the rock and caught Jenkins with one powerful arm, stabilizing him until he could regain his handholds. Neither man spoke. A nod was all that passed between them, acknowledgement that they had just averted disaster. 4 hours into the climb, the rain intensified, turning the rock face into a slippery cascade. Men clung to the mountain by sheer force of will, fingers bleeding from sharp rock edges, arms burning with fatigue. But not one suggested turning back. They had come too far, endured too much. The ascent was more than physically demanding. It was a psychological crucible. Each man fought his own private battle against fear, fatigue, and doubt. They climbed in a void, unable to see the bottom that would claim them if they fell, unable to see the top that promised both rest and combat. They existed in a liminal space between earth and sky, life and death. "You couldn't see more than a few feet ahead," McPherson later recounted. "Just rain and rock and the outline of the man in front of you. Every handhold might be your last if it gave way, and all the while knowing that if you made it to the top, the Germans would be waiting." But there was something strangely calming about focusing on just the next move, the next grip. The world shrank to just your hands and the rock. Nothing else mattered in those moments. As they neared the summit, the gradient mercifully decreased. The vertical cliff gave way to a steep slope that allowed for more secure movement. The men spread out into combat formation, weapons at the ready. They could hear German voices now, guards talking, unaware that death climbed toward them from what they had deemed an impossible approach. By dawn on December 3rd, the force had achieved what the Germans had considered impossible. They had scaled the cliffs and were in position to strike. As the first light broke, they launched their assault, taking the German defenders completely by surprise. The fighting was brutal and close quarters, exactly what the force had been trained for. Their specialized skills proved decisive. Men who had been lumberjacks knew precisely how to use explosive charges against bunkers. Hunters from the Canadian wilderness could spot camouflaged positions that others missed. And the notorious V-42 knives proved devastatingly effective in the chaos of close combat. Within 2 hours, the summit was secured. The force had accomplished in a single morning what conventional units had failed to achieve after multiple attempts. But the cost had been high. 90 men killed or missing, over 300 wounded. The victory at Monte la Defensa was followed by successful assaults on Monte la Remetanea and other key points along the Winter Line. By mid-January 1944, the 1st Special Service Force had played a crucial role in breaking the German defenses south of Rome, but their ranks had been severely depleted by the intense combat. Of the original 1,800 men who had entered combat in December, fewer than 500 remained unwounded and combat-ready by late January. For most units, such casualties would have meant a period of rest, reinforcement, and retraining. The 1st Special Service Force received different orders. Anzio. On January 22, 1944, Allied forces launched Operation Shingle, an amphibious landing at Anzio, just 35 miles south of Rome. The landing was intended to outflank the German Winter Line and potentially capture Rome. Instead, it developed into one of the most bitterly contested battles of the Italian campaign. German forces under Field Marshal Albert Kesselring quickly contained the beachhead, surrounding the Allied position with artillery and elite units. By the time the 1st Special Service Force arrived on February 1st, the situation at Anzio was grim. The beachhead was under constant artillery fire, Allied forces were largely pinned down, and the Germans were preparing counterattacks to drive them back into the sea. The force, now reinforced with replacements but still well below full strength, was given a daunting assignment: hold the right flank of the beachhead along the Mussolini Canal. The sector they were assigned was over 8 miles long, a frontage normally assigned to an entire division of 10,000 men. The force had fewer than 1,200. Conventional defense was impossible with such limited numbers stretched across such a wide area. Frederick, never one for conventional thinking, devised an alternative approach. If the force couldn't defend in the traditional sense, they would make their sector so terrifying that the Germans would be reluctant to approach it. "We can't hold a line," Frederick told his officers, "so we won't try. We'll own the night instead." And so began the period that would cement the force's legendary status and earn them the name that would echo through military history: the Black Devils. Each night, small teams of force operators would blacken their faces with boot polish or burnt cork, tape down any equipment that might make noise, and cross the canal into German territory. The ritual of preparation was almost spiritual in nature, men transforming themselves from soldiers into shadows, from hunters into predators. The blacking of the face wasn't just for camouflage, Lieutenant Jack Warner, a force officer from Toronto, explained after the war. It was psychological. When you looked in the mirror and saw that dark face looking back, something changed inside you. You became something else, something ancient and primal. The rational world fell away, and you were just a hunter in the night. Armed with their V-42 knives, piano wire garrots, and silenced weapons, they would infiltrate German positions to gather intelligence, capture prisoners, sabotage equipment, and eliminate sentries. Some missions required stealth above all else. observing German movements, counting vehicles, identifying unit insignia. Others were focused on specific targets, taking out a machine gun nest that had been causing problems for Allied positions, capturing an officer for interrogation, or sabotaging communications equipment. The men moved according to a precise doctrine developed through trial and error. They traveled in 3 to 6 man teams, maintaining arm's-length distance in open terrain and closing up in dense vegetation. They used hand signals exclusively once they crossed the canal, having developed an elaborate system of silent communication that allowed them to coordinate complex actions without making a sound. Their tactics were a blend of Native American hunting techniques, frontier woodcraft, and modern military science. They moved only when ambient noise could mask their footsteps, during artillery barrages, aircraft overflights, or the rumble of distant vehicles. They froze into absolute stillness when danger threatened, becoming so immobile that German patrols would walk past without spotting them, sometimes within touching distance. We learned to control even our breathing, Corporal Mike Hawkins, a former hunting guide from Maine, recalled. You'd slow everything down, your heart rate, your respiration, even your thoughts. You become like a stone or a tree, just another piece of the landscape. I once lay motionless for 4 hours while a German patrol set up a position 10 yards from where I was hiding. They never knew I was there, and when they finally left, I completed my mission and got back across the canal with the intelligence we needed. The force developed specialized techniques for different weather conditions. On moonlit nights, they stayed in shadows and moved during cloud cover. On the darkest nights, they navigated by touch and memorized terrain features. In rain, they used the noise of water to mask movement, but took extra precautions against leaving trackable footprints. In fog, they moved more freely but maintained strict orientation to avoid becoming lost. Some raids involved larger formations, platoon or even company-sized operations that struck specific objectives with overwhelming force before melting back into the night. But it was the small team operations that became the force's signature, the silent infiltrations that spread fear throughout the German lines. Staff Sergeant Robert Daniels led one of the most audacious raids in late February. With just 5 men, he penetrated over 2 miles into German territory to place explosive charges on a bridge being used to move artillery pieces. The demolition was timed to coincide with the movement of a German artillery battery across the span. The resulting explosion destroyed not just the bridge but 6 100 mm howitzers and their prime movers, along with dozens of German artillerymen. The psychological impact of these raids was profound. German troops began to report that silent, black-faced commandos would appear from nowhere, kill without sound, and vanish back into the darkness. They never knew where the force would strike next, or in what strength. Survivors described waking to find the men on either side of them dead, throats cut, without having heard a sound. Sentries would disappear without firing a shot, their posts marked only by a pool of blood and the ubiquitous sticker warning that the worst is yet to come. The atmosphere of fear became so pervasive that German units began to fire randomly into the darkness, wasting ammunition and revealing their positions. Sleep deprivation became common among German troops, further degrading their combat effectiveness. Some began to refuse night duty altogether, risking military discipline rather than facing the terror of the Black Devils. Fear is a weapon just like bullets or bombs, Frederick told his officers, but it's more efficient. A bullet can kill 1 man. Fear can paralyze an entire unit. Perhaps the most famous evidence of their impact came from the diary of a German officer killed during one of these raids. In it, he had written, "The Black Devils are all around us every time we come into the line. We never hear them come." Sergeant Thomas O'Neill, the Canadian lumberjack who had become one of the force's most effective night raiders, described their tactics. "We moved like we were hunting deer back home. Slow, deliberate, aware of every twig and sound. The difference was these deer shot back if they spotted you, so we made sure they never did until it was too late." The force's night raids were not merely psychological operations. They provided crucial intelligence about German dispositions and prevented the enemy from massing forces for attacks. The Germans were forced to pull their defensive positions back from the canal to avoid the nightly infiltrations, creating a no-man's land that gave the thinly spread force more warning of any major enemy movements. Statistics tell the story of their effectiveness. For every forceman killed, they eliminated 25 German soldiers. For every forceman captured, they took 2,035 prisoners. They were destructive far beyond their numbers, tying down German forces that could have been used elsewhere. For 99 days without relief, the force held their sector at Anzio. They endured constant artillery bombardment during the day and conducted their terrifying raids at night. Despite being vastly outnumbered, they never lost a foot of ground to German attacks. One particular raid in late February exemplified their methods. A 12-man team led by Lieutenant John Cooper crossed the canal to attack a German artillery observation post that had been directing accurate fire onto Allied positions. Moving silently through 3 miles of enemy territory, they located the camouflaged position on a small hill. Cooper divided his men into 3 groups and orchestrated a simultaneous assault from different directions. The German position, manned by 15 soldiers and 2 officers, was overrun before they could offer organized resistance. The force operators killed 7 Germans, captured the remainder, and withdrew with valuable maps and communication equipment. The entire operation, conducted deep in enemy territory, resulted in no casualties for the force team. More importantly, German artillery fire became noticeably less accurate in that sector afterward. By May 1944, the stalemate at Anzio was nearing its end. Allied forces prepared for a major breakout operation to push inland and finally take Rome. The 1st Special Service Force, having earned a fearsome reputation, was selected to spearhead part of the offensive. On May 23, 1944, the Allies launched Operation Buffalo, the breakout from the Anzio beachhead. The force, despite being at less than half its original strength, was tasked with capturing the town of Artena, a key position on the road to Rome. Moving with the speed and aggression that had become their trademark, the force overwhelmed the German defenses at Artena within hours. When German armor counterattacked, force operators used captured German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapons against their former owners with devastating effect. "We'd learned to use their weapons better than they did," Daniels, now a staff sergeant, recalled after the war. "Anything that could kill, we mastered it. Didn't matter if it was American, Canadian, British, or German. If it had a trigger or a blade, we knew how to make it work." With the Anzio breakout successful, Allied forces pushed toward Rome. In recognition of their extraordinary performance, General Mark Clark, commander of the Fifth Army, selected the 1st Special Service Force to lead the entry into the Eternal City. On June 4, 1944, the force became the first Allied unit to enter Rome. They secured key bridges over the Tiber River, preventing their destruction by retreating German forces and enabling the rapid advance of Allied armor. 2 days later, while the force was still clearing pockets of resistance in Rome, the Allies launched Operation Overlord, the D-Day landings in Normandy. For the men of the force, the capture of Rome represented a triumph after months of brutal combat. But there was little time to rest. By mid-June, they were in action again, pursuing retreating German forces north of Rome. The next major assignment for the 1st Special Service Force came in August 1944 as part of Operation Dragoon, the Allied invasion of southern France. Their mission was to capture fortified German positions on 2 islands off the French coast, Ile du Levant and Port Creuse, to prevent German artillery from targeting the main landing beaches. On August 15th, the force executed an amphibious assault on the islands. Despite heavy resistance, they secured both objectives within 2 days, capturing over 1,000 prisoners. Following this success, they joined the advance along the French Riviera, pushing toward the Italian border. By this stage of the war, the unique capabilities of the force were becoming less essential. The front lines were moving rapidly, conventional forces were available in large numbers, and the specialized skills of the force were not as critical as they had been in the mountain warfare of Italy or the confined beachhead at Anzio. On December 5, 1944, in a small ceremony near Menton, France, the 1st Special Service Force was officially disbanded. The Canadian members returned to Canadian units while the Americans were distributed among airborne divisions or formed the core of the new 474th Infantry Regiment. For men like McPherson and Daniels, who had been with the force from its earliest days in Montana, the disbandment marked the end of an extraordinary chapter. They had been part of something unique, a unit that had redefined what small elite forces could accomplish. "We knew it was coming," McPherson wrote to his family. "The war had changed, but what we'd built, that brotherhood between Canadians and Americans, that way of fighting, that wouldn't die with the unit. We'd shown what was possible. In just 28 months of existence, including 15 months in combat, the 1st Special Service Force had compiled an astonishing record. They had spearheaded the breaking of the winter line, held a crucial sector at Anzio against overwhelming odds, led the entry into Rome, and cleared the islands during the invasion of southern France. Their casualties reflected the intensity of their combat, a 758% replacement rate over their time in action. Put simply, for every original member of the force, more than 7 replacements were eventually required due to deaths, wounds, or combat exhaustion. The legacy of the Black Devils extended far beyond their direct combat achievements. Their innovative tactics, cross-border integration, and elite selection and training protocols would influence special operations forces for generations to come. After the war, members of the force returned to civilian life, carrying their experiences with them. James McPherson went back to British Columbia, where he used his leadership skills to build a successful logging company that employed many fellow veterans. Robert Daniels took a different path, joining the newly formed Central Intelligence Agency, where his unconventional thinking and experience in covert operations proved valuable in the early Cold War years. Colonel Frederick, the unlikely leader who had molded the force into a legendary unit, continued his military career. He became the youngest general officer in the U.S. Army at the time and commanded the 45th Infantry Division during the final push into Germany. After the war, he served in various command and diplomatic positions before retiring in 1952. The operational methods pioneered by the 1st Special Service Force directly influenced the creation of Special Forces units in both the United States and Canada. The U.S. Army's Special Forces, Green Berets, trace their lineage directly to the force, as do elements of Canadian Special Operations Forces. In recognition of their extraordinary service, the U.S. Congress awarded the Congressional Gold Medal to the 1st Special Service Force in February 2015, 70 years after the unit's disbandment. By then, few original members remained alive to receive the honor. When we look at modern special operations forces around the world, we see the DNA of the Black Devils in their organization, tactics, and ethos. The integration of specialized skills, the emphasis on small unit operations behind enemy lines, the psychological impact of elite forces. All these elements that define modern special warfare were pioneered or perfected by the force. Perhaps the most lasting legacy of the 1st Special Service Force was proving that conventional warfare wasn't the only path to victory. In a war dominated by massive armies and industrial production, they demonstrated that small numbers of exceptionally trained men employing unconventional tactics could have an impact far beyond their numbers. The night raids at Anzio exemplified this approach. A handful of men, moving silently through the darkness, created uncertainty and fear across an entire front. Their legend grew with each successful operation until the mere suspicion of their presence was enough to affect German morale and decision-making. As military historian Joseph Balkowski noted, they weren't just killing the enemy, they were attacking their sense of security, their confidence. When soldiers don't feel safe, even in their own lines, when they believe that death might come silently in the night from an enemy they never see, their effectiveness is profoundly diminished. The psychological impact of the force's operations at Anzio was so significant that German units began to request transfers away from the sectors facing the Black Devils. Captured German documents revealed that their high command estimated the force's strength at division level, more than 10 times their actual numbers, based on their operational footprint. What made the 1st Special Service Force so effective wasn't just their training or equipment, though both were exceptional for the time. It was their mindset, an aggressive, solution-oriented approach to warfare that refused to acknowledge conventional limitations. When faced with unclimbable cliffs at Monte la Defensa, they climbed them. When assigned a frontage at Anzio that no unit their size could possibly hold by conventional means, they rewrote the rules of engagement. When conventional wisdom said cross-border military integration was too complicated, they made it work seamlessly. The modern world of special operations, with its emphasis on small footprint, high-impact missions, owes much to the Black Devils who prowled the darkness at Anzio. Their legacy lives on in the night vision-equipped operators who descend from helicopters to conduct raids against terrorist compounds, in the small teams that operate behind enemy lines to gather intelligence or disable critical infrastructure, and in the very concept that elite specialized forces can achieve strategic effects disproportionate to their numbers. For the men who served in the 1st Special Service Force, their experience was transformative. They had been part of something extraordinary, a unit that asked more of them than seemed humanly possible, then proved that such demands could be met. The bonds forged in that crucible of training and combat lasted lifetimes. As Robert Daniels put it in his last interview before his death in 1989, people talk about the greatest generation, and maybe that's true for all of us who fought in that war. But the force was something else entirely. We weren't just fighting a war, we were inventing a new way to fight, and that way is still being used today, wherever there's a need for men who can do the impossible in the dark. The story of the Black Devils is not just a tale of military innovation or battlefield heroism, though it certainly includes both. It's also a reminder that in the darkest times when conventional approaches fail, human ingenuity and courage can forge new paths forward. On a cold February night in 1944, as Sergeant Thomas O'Neill and his men silently crossed the Mussolini Canal with blackened faces and deadly intent, they weren't just conducting another raid. They were demonstrating a truth that remains relevant in every arena of human conflict. Sometimes the most effective response to overwhelming force isn't greater force, but greater creativity, precision, and daring. Would you have broken the order or obeyed it? Would you have found the courage to climb an unclimbable cliff in the darkness, knowing that elite German troops waited at the top? Would you have crossed enemy lines night after night, moving silently through terrain where discovery meant certain death? These questions have no easy answers, but they remind us that the freedom we enjoy today was secured not just by the immense industrial might and numerical superiority of Allied forces, but also by small bands of extraordinary individuals who risked everything in the darkness, leaving behind only their chilling message, "The worst is yet to come." Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means, and what a small group of determined individuals can accomplish when conventional wisdom says their task is impossible.